face a challenging threat environment. As the new administration and Congress prepare to come to Washington next month, reconsidering the future of cybersecurity policy and strategy, including information sharing, should be atop the agenda. Today, we're thrilled to be hosting a panel of national cybersecurity experts to examine where we've been and where we need to go. I'll make some brief introductions before we jump into our discussion. First, Maggie Brunner is a program director for Homeland Security and Public Safety at the National Governors Association, the bipartisan organization representing the nation's governors. Prior to joining NGA in 2017, Maggie was an associate at the Police Executive Research Forum, where she worked on Homeland Security issues that affected state and local law enforcement. She's also worked with the Department of Homeland Security's Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Matthew Eggers is the Vice President for Cybersecurity Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Matt's portfolio includes Homeland Security and national security issues, including chemical security, biosecurity, and emerging security threats, which he handles on behalf of the Chamber's approximately 300 National Security Task Force members. In 2018, he was selected to be part of The Network, the Washington Post survey of influential people in cybersecurity from across government, the private sector, and the security research community. Next, Mark Montgomery is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense on Democracies, and he's recently served as the executive director for the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which has played a leading role in shaping federal cybersecurity legislation during the 116th Congress. Mark previously served as policy director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under the leadership of former Senator John McCain. Mark's also served for 32 years in the US Navy as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, retiring as a Rear Admiral in 2017. He previously served on the National Security Council. Last, Kathleen Rice Mosier is an adjunct professor of law at Notre Dame University. Kathleen provides advice to organizations on issues relating to data privacy, cybersecurity, risk management, and compliance with federal laws and regulations. Prior to entering private practice, Kathleen served for 20 years in the federal government, including as counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, as an assistant general counsel in the FBI's National Security Law Branch, and as assistant US attorney in the Southern District of Florida. This is a truly expert guest, so we're really thrilled to have you all. A programming note for all of our people joining us: we're happy to take questions from the audience as we get into our discussion. Please feel free to submit your questions in the chat. With Mark's presence on the panel and the great success of the Solarium Commission having its recommendations be considered as law and likely to become law before the end of the year, I'm excited to talk about the future of cybersecurity information sharing, including what are the outstanding recommendations from the Commission that could be considered next year. But I thought it would be helpful to first step back and think about where we were in 2015 and the years that led up to that, and what we've learned since that landmark law has passed. I'm thrilled to have Kathleen here, because when I was thinking about this panel and who could help us understand what led to the 2015 law, Kathleen was first in mind. For years, Kathleen, you worked on that legislation for the SSCI staff and were involved in drafting it and shaping what came to be law in 2015. I was hoping you could share with us some of your thoughts about why that law came to be and some of the challenges you faced in developing it.
Sure. Thanks, Dan, and thank you for inviting us and for hosting this important discussion. I think Matt Eggers could also speak to some of the pain that we endured for years trying to get cyber information sharing legislation through Congress. But let me take it back several years before 2015. There were numerous efforts in Congress to try to legislate around the issue of cybersecurity, but most of those were very committee-centric. So armed services would deal with military, intelligence, the intelligence committees would deal with the intelligence aspects, but nobody was looking across the board and saying, what can we do that might make a difference, not just within the federal government, but for the private sector as well. And in our experience on the Intelligence Committee, we kept hearing from organizations, from businesses, telling us that there were barriers to effectively sharing information with each other in the form of antitrust concerns. And there were concerns about trying to get information back from the government. particularly because of classification issues. So it was with that backdrop that members really started digging into this. There was a large bill sponsored by Senators Lieberman and Collins that tried to look across a large swath of cybersecurity issues. That bill had a lot of opposition, not just from within Congress, but from within the business community as well, because it imposed government mandates on organizations that put DHS in charge of cybersecurity, which a lot of people had concerns about in terms of their capabilities, in terms of their ability to be nimble in meeting cybersecurity threats. And the bill also did not put forward a clear path for trying to work with FBI and NSA in terms of sharing information, in terms of receiving information, because of concerns that had arisen with the leaks from Edward Snowden. So all of that was happening in the 2011, 2012 timeframe. And then in order to counter that, a group of ranking members in the Senate, led by Senator McCain, Senator Chambliss from the Intel Committee, decided to put forward a bill that that tried to address issues that should have been non-controversial. And information sharing was part of that. And that bill, Secure IT, ultimately did not get a vote in Congress that year. The Lieberman-Collins bill also failed. So that brought us to 2014. And at that point, Senator Chambliss and Senator Feinstein, who had been on dueling bills, decided that they would at least try to find common ground on information sharing. And that effort to find common ground gave rise to the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act that ultimately was enacted in 2015.
So I was there in that last Congress where you were working on this in 2013 and 2015. And that year, some of us were able to move our bills through. We had bills to update federal cybersecurity, or FISMA, basically spelling out the lines between OMB and DHS, helping to sort of scope DHS's emerging role. We also at that time in 2014, passed a bill to authorize the NKIC, which sort of later would become CISA. But I recall at the end of that Congress, there was a scramble to try and move the information sharing bill, but it faced a lot of hurdles.
It faced a lot of hurdles because people objected to it primarily to two things. The first was allowing information to also flow to the FBI and the NSA. And people really wanted to try to, some people wanted to try to keep DHS as the sole means for information to travel to the government. But in working with the private sector, it became clear that when you go outside of Washington, D.C., people have their own relationships. They work with FBI field offices. Different industries, particularly the telecoms, work closely with NSA. And we were trying to find a way to build on those relationships rather than trying to steer everybody towards what we were concerned would become a DHS bottleneck.
And so a year later, the Congress succeeded in moving that legislation, in part because they established that bottleneck.
Correct. Now, in my view, they didn't do it perfectly, but that's because of the nature of the compromise. And I know that there have been a lot of issues since then in trying to get people to still, number one, to understand how information should be shared and why information should be shared. And I think, Matt, you've done a lot of work with businesses trying to get them comfortable with that. But it did go a long way towards at least establishing the premise that you would be protected from liability for sharing information, including if you went beyond simply to DHS.
That's right. And if I may, Kathleen, thanks. And I think compromise is the name of the game. Nobody always embraces that readily. But if we're going to get legislation done, I think that's what we need to do. One of the things that I think we were going to bat for Secure IT, which probably provided the cleanest sharing plus liability and other related protections that was available. When Lieberman-Collins, that bill kind of suffered from two non-successful cloture votes, I think August and November of that year, not that I remember. We realized that a few of the elements that could get pulled out, I think if I recall, it was Title VII, that was the information sharing piece.
Right.
And between about then and 15, it went through various iterations. But the whole idea really was, and it wasn't that controversial, which is we need a neighborhood watch. We need to kind of gather the techniques, processes, what have you, that bad guys use to go after companies and the government, come up with a way to share those indicators in real time, as well as defensive measures, and kind of have people's backs when they do it. I think we did what we could, and I was pretty pleased with what Capitol Hill developed in partnership with industry. I think we started off with a coalition of about 10 groups, and then I said, hey, let's go to 20 and 30 and 40, and we got up to 50, I think, basically trade associations. And it was a lot of work, but I think maybe, roughly about 2 years following, let's say, Edward Snowden revelations, and frankly, the sharing of threat indicators and some of the other things that were related to that didn't go together, but I was pleased to see that we were able to get a lot of different parties, Capitol Hill and the Obama administration on board. And so I think it's been a pretty good thing, and we're into it 5 years as of tomorrow.
Can you speak to what you've seen over the past 5 years, Matt? In terms
I would say this. I think on balance, I think what we've seen and what we've wanted to see is, in my mind, which is if we've got companies that are sharing indicators, defensive measures on a regular basis, that kind of tells you that they've got a level of maturity. And so in a lot of ways, we weren't really looking to just share for sharing's sake, although that was part of it. But to have a robust sharing program where you can send and receive, that tells me that you've got a plan to protect your system networks, and you're going kind of above and beyond what most companies have typically done. One thing that I was just going to flag, because I thought it was useful, and I was glad that he did it, was David Turetsky, I think used to be at the FCC, but is now at the University of Albany, put together a report this summer that collected and documented a lot of success stories around information sharing. But frankly, my experience is most companies and organizations don't come to me and say, hey, we've just been sharing indicators under the CISA program. Hopefully, what happens is companies have engaged in more dialogue, the sharing of indicators. They're also scrubbing any PII. And in the context of maybe solar wind, some of these discussions and some of these mitigation efforts, without maybe knowing it, have been maybe facilitated because of that law. And I don't know if we really know yet, but hopefully that's a good outcome.
And I would agree with that, Dan. In my experience working with organizations, particularly ones that are coming out of or dealing with data security incidents, potential data breaches, they are, number one, there's not always an awareness of what CISA provides in terms of liability protection. Number two, there's not necessarily a sense that an organization would have information that the government would want. And then number three, there's also not a comfort level that if you share information with the government, that you're going to get information back that might be helpful for you to do what you need to do to defend your networks. So I think those things are still very much a work in progress. And I know Matt's done a tremendous job with trying to get the message out there for organizations of all sizes in all sectors. But I think there's just still a lot of work to be done.
No doubt.
Now, we've focused this largely on a conversation around the private sector, but over the past 5 years, where we've seen some of the increasing threat activity and incidents involving cybersecurity has come at the state and local level. For example, the ransomware attacks that have been occurring over the past couple of years, growing concern about supply chain, which I'd love for us to get into a little later. Maggie, I know you speak for the NGA, but I know you have a sense of what's been happening at the state and local level. What have you seen in terms of the changing threat environment, and how are states and others working with the federal government?
Yeah, thanks for that. Really appreciate what Kathleen said, because that kind of teed me up in terms of information sharing outside of the Beltway. You really want to take advantage of whoever people are comfortable reporting to. And so obviously sort of the biggest interest for states is ensuring that the private sector wants to work with them directly. So we have actually seen states pass their own version of CISA bills. And that, I think, just sort of lends to the voice of, you're able to come to us and you'll be protected from liability, even though, the federal bill did preempt state law. But at the same time, too, that was also because of a very specific gap that was identified. We wanted to make sure at the state level that a lot of times it's general counsel making these decisions about whether to come forward or not. And per lawyers' rules of professional conduct, want to make sure at the state level that we were being very specific about if this is a permissible sharing of confidential client information. So what is the threat level at the state? I mean, I think that we're seeing a lot of the same things that the private sector are seeing. Obviously, ransomware is a huge concern, just because, not only does that really kind of stop operations, but if you're a government entity, it threatens continuity of government. So we're definitely very concerned about that threat. And continuing forward, just the way that we're seeing that become more sophisticated and not just be about encrypting data, but then also threatening to release it as well. COVID is really underscoring a lot of that, where we're seeing kids go virtual. And so really thinking about how do we, protect a whole other set of folks that don't directly kind of come under the purview of the governor. But I would say from the governor's perspective, that's been the biggest change over the past 2 years. It's not just about how do we secure state IT infrastructure and how do we just think very narrowly about the state network. Of course, that's a very important job, and the CISOs are doing a fantastic job of that. But a governor's not going to see a ransomware attack take down a local government and want to stand back and say, not our problem. So state-local partnerships, I think, has been the biggest area of growth, and states see a role in sort of interpreting some of the information that does come down from CISA for their local counterparts. And we've seen sort of a lot of increased interaction there. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but in terms of the relationship with the federal government, states, I think, are really appreciate any sort of assistance that they can provide as the nation's risk advisor.
That's great. Thank you. Mark, I'd love to bring you into this discussion. Over the past 2 years, you've had this, with the commission, it's had this ability to look at a grand strategy and rethinking of national cybersecurity and where we should be headed. Can you speak to how you're thinking about the challenges that we face and where information sharing fits into this? I think you may be on mute.
Thanks, sure. The first thing I'd say is a general complaint about the naming of this bill and then the naming of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency 3 years later, which obviously confuses everybody because you basically have a CISA Act in 2015 and 2018 that's killing us.
Mark, we didn't get it either, but hey, that's so it goes.
All right. So, but looking at it, what happened was you fast forward from Kathleen's discussion of Senator McCain being involved in 2012 and 2013. By 2016, 2017, there's a level of frustration on the Hill that, what we considered a normal strategy of deterrence, having a strong, capable armed forces, a strong, capable cyber command, was not preventing cyber activity, below the level of use of force. So we weren't getting nation state attacks that took down our electrical power grid, but we were having a lot of, espionage, whether it was the OPM break-in, the assessment of intellectual property theft over 15 years, the DPRK attack on North Korea, the cyber-enabled IO against our election infrastructure in 2016 by Russia, and then we saw again in 2018. There was this feeling that we needed to do something. We needed to assess what is the appropriate strategic approach. And so when we took a look at it in that environment, we thought that you could not just rely on the idea of offensive, of doing persistent engagement and defend forward, which we do value, doing some level of offensive operations, but you actually really did need to build an effective cyber defense. And this is unusual for us. I think everyone in this group understands, and everyone listening, that cyber removed the geographic advantage we'd had for 70 or 100 years, with the Atlantic and the Pacific and good neighbors in Canada and Mexico, that we didn't have to defend our infrastructure. Well, now because of cyber, that geographic benefit's gone. We actually had to defend it. And this is a hard thing. And so what I would say is information sharing fits in there critically. It's one of the 4 or 5 elements that you really need to get right. The first is you actually do have to have good cybersecurity. Probably something we learned from SolarWinds is that over reliance on external markers, things like what Einstein and other intrusion detection systems do, there's a risk in that. But you have to have internal anomalous activity detectors running, looking at that kind of thing. But that costs a lot of money. So you have to have a robust investment in your own cybersecurity. You have to have a system that identifies threats and exchanges that information rapidly, so that if you're doing persistent engagement and you come across a tool and you want to make it so that tool doesn't have an impact on your own critical infrastructure, you have to figure out how you bring that tool back, sanitize how you got the data, and push it back out into the ecosystem as something to be concerned about. And when you do see an attack, that you rapidly develop patches to push them around. But information sharing is a critical element of that. I think it goes beyond information sharing. It really goes into analysis. And that's because one of the things that happens now is we push a lot of data around, but the government is not the arbiter of everything. And we don't necessarily own a lot of the systems, own or operate a lot of the systems that the private sector does. So we will see things in threat information and not understand what the risk in it is. But if you were to hand it to someone from Verizon or someone from Southern companies, Power, from their IT, they look at it and go, that's a problem for us. That kind of malware or that kind of event will cause X and Y and Z and introduce a significant amount of risk into our stability. So that it's got to go beyond just information sharing, but it's got to be this, in our mind, it's got to be this joint analytical effort. You see little microcosms of this in Israel and the UK on a very much smaller scale than we would probably need to run. But what I would say about information sharing is it's critical, and it's really the first step into building collaboration. And that collaboration includes this analytical framework. And kind of importantly, it includes the private sector influencing government. We tend to think of the government influencing private sector as, we're going to tell them what's the right answer. But equally important is the private sector saying, we operate a lot of these kind of systems. You don't operate them in .gov or .mil, but we operate them in .com, in our infrastructure. We need to know if malware is being developed against these types of systems. And that needs to somehow be prioritized in our national intelligence prioritization framework, what we collect, what we look for when we're snooping around things, so that we get an idea, or when we come across malicious software, so that our intelligence community has an understanding of what the private sector needs are. And so, you put that all together, that's collaboration, but information sharing is a bedrock element of it.
I think it's really interesting that you raise that perspective about collection requirements. One of the pieces of legislation inspired by the commission that you mentioned when we first spoke was involved essentially establishing that type of process where the intelligence community would go out to the private sector, owners and operators of critical infrastructure, and ask for what their needs are, and to try and scope that future collection and analysis. One of the things we've heard about information sharing over the years, informally from the private sector, but also in government reports from the watchdogs, is that often it's not of value. And I think that could really get at improving the value of what's coming back to the private sector.
I think, Dan and Mark, I think you hit the nail on the head with respect to what the role, the respective roles are or should be. I remember back when Lieberman Collins was on the table, and then Secure IT, there was a lot of discussion about who's really the big player or the big force here? And the bottom line is, it really isn't the government, except in terms of classified information that might be useful and not in the possession of the private sector. It's the private sector that's seeing all of these things come across their networks in real time. And I think that the challenge, Mark, you alluded to it, is how to set up that collaboration using information sharing as a vehicle. But how do you make each entity, each party really strong with respect to what they can bring to the table? And I think there's been such a reliance or a perspective that the government can solve this problem, and they really can't. I think it's got to be much more collaborative than it has been.
I think that's right. I think one of the things that you allude to, you all hear is recommendations, I think 511, 512, which maybe, I think in some ways, maybe the latest evolution of information sharing, where I think the idea is for some of our key sector parties, which are in all our states, to sit almost side by side with some of the governmental professionals, where we can learn more about what each other does, what our differing needs are, and use that information to act, hopefully, in advance of an attack. One thing that I think is interesting, we've now had maybe, 3 major muscle movements on cyber. The first one was kind of Lieberman-Collins. Next one was the information sharing legislation. Now, I would say collectively, the number of bills that Mark and the commission were able to clear and likely will get signed into law, hopefully. Maybe they learned, and maybe I'll credit Mark with maybe looking at it this way, is maybe the answer isn't a single bill, but multiple bills. So a single vehicle doesn't get shot down, let's say. And if that was the thinking, then I think that was probably the right way to go. One of the things that, at least from a strategy standpoint, I think one of the things that stands out to me is there are recommendations that should give CISA, part of DHS, a leg up to do more. I think there is still that effort to try to have tighter coordination. I continually hear, Mark, I'm sure has, Dan, you have, Maggie, you have, Kathleen, you did, still do, I'm sure, where businesses will say, hey, I'm not getting that kind of juicy information I want or need. I'm not sure that a government will ever supply that, but I think one of the ideas is with some of these new recommendations that did not clear this year is to get a better understanding of what maybe the IC can go after in partnership with some of our companies. Now, not every organization or company is going to be involved here. They're going to probably self-select, but I think that may be the next iteration of this information sharing effort. I could be wrong, but I think so.
Mark, could you speak to your kind of legislative recommendations?
Yeah, that's good, and I agree with a lot of what Matthew said there. So look, we came up. One thing I loved about McCain, he's biased towards action. So I said, look, you got 1 year as a commission, soup to nuts. Get your report out within 1 year, and then work the legislative system. And he said, to make that legislative system work, I'm going to give you I'm going to place 4 active legislators on the commission, which is genius, right? Because you actually have, 4 action officers, and some of them took that very, very seriously. Jim Langevin, for example, who happened to also be a subcommittee chair in the House, which is an extremely powerful position versus, say, the Senate. And so we came up with a strategic approach. You can read it in our report, and we described the threat. I do like doing everything unclassified. America writes great law. One of the great things about our great law is that it's unclassified. I think it's, secret law, generally not such a good thing. So we do a good job with this. And he said, keep it. So we did a 15-page unclassified thing that if when you're done reading that, you don't think there's a problem, then nothing we ever say is going to convince you there's a challenge in cybersecurity. But then we had 82 legislative recommendations that were based on the strategic approach that we recommended. Those 82 recommendations had 52 legislative. We tried to run 36 of them through this NDAA. We knew we'd probably get an attempt at another NDAA. So we went for 36. In the end, 29 made it into conference and 25 made it in the final report. A couple got split up and they became 27 provisions. This was easily the most comprehensive cybersecurity legislation the Congress has ever passed. Not just because of the 27 we had, there are another 50 cybersecurity in there. Now, 15 or 20 of them are very, very detailed, specific DoD, tweak the rheostat ones, but there's another 20 to 30 meaningful, whole of government ones in there. So it's a very rich, has its own cybersecurity Title 17. It really is good. Now, what I said about that rheostat's interesting. One of the real challenges is, I think when the team here passed CISA 2015, there's got to be this sense of relief. We did it. It's weird. In DoD and the Armed Services Committee, it's a completely different approach. It's, hey, I'll see you in 2 months. We'll start again. And we'll pass something guaranteed 10 months from then. There's a law every year. Cybersecurity is the kind of mission that requires a law every year. There is no way CISA 2015 was 100% right. It never had a chance to be. And CISA 2014 or 2016 wouldn't have been 100% right, or 2018. You need to be able to set the rheostat on cyber every year. It is a warfare area. We have to treat it like that. And I know this makes several committees cringe in the House and Senate. But if the NDAA is the only vehicle that goes every year, there needs to be cybersecurity for national security purposes every year, tweaking those rheostats, getting it right. I promise you, some of the stuff we put in our 27 provisions, some have errors. I promise you, and that's after being rewritten, but all to the better by staffs. All 27 of our provisions don't reflect what we wrote originally in our report. All had change, but they all got better from staff work. But I promise you, they still have error. And one or two kind of suck. I mean, there's one now on threat hunting on the DIB that we have to, which instead of having it the way we said it, which is threat hunting the DIB, it was watered down to, hey, let's talk about having threat hunting in the DIB a year from now. Kind of wish we had threat hunting on the DIB right now. Looking for anomalous activity running inside defense industrial base companies. We might have discovered something running since March in some of those companies. That, to me, that anomalous behavior detection is critical. The aggressive use of red teams against your vulnerable, critical national security systems is absolutely essential. Now, Matthew mentioned it is one of the CISA ones we did get passed in Folsom. CISA to threat hunt on .gov. A little late for SolarWinds, but okay for the next time. But my point on this is you need these rheostats. You need an annual opportunity to improve your cybersecurity legislation. And you need to know you can come back. So you make the deal. You make the deal that's 80%. You go, geez, we got 80%. That's fantastic. If I got to get 10% of the last 20%, I'll come next year and argue with Matthew about it. Not that we argued with the chamber a lot, but a little. We'll come back and do that. But that's how you get business done. And I'm hoping they can do that next year.
No, I think that's certainly right. I think it is hard to get the bills just so, and I think it's probably I'll give it more thought, but I think on balance, it's probably better to try to pursue smaller, more narrowly tailored bills, which can be revised more easily down the road. Meaning, if they overreach, they don't overreach too much. If they underreach, they can be amended down the road. That may be the best way to go. And one thing on topic, one area where we didn't see eye to eye, but I do think it will come back, is the cyber incident reporting amendment that Mr. Richmond offered up. One of the things we think about with respect to almost any policy law reg is something that I kind of dub a 3 Ps or 4 Ps model, which is you want to have some kind of program where there's reciprocity or flexibility of choosing among, let's say, certain cyber standards, programs, what have you. Maybe preemption where applicable, certainly protections, liability, regulation, partnerships. CISA certainly fits that bill, 2015. Price, meaning trade-offs. And I think, if anything, I'm not sure we've got all the answers that we would want to have answered with respect to that provision, but it just gives you an example of where that issue is going to stick around, and we'll probably be coming back to it. Anyway.
Mark, can you speak to any of what you see as the top items you'd like to see moving in the next Congress that are?
Yeah. So, first, and I'll follow up one quickly on Matthew. I say every once in a while you do have to do a big thing. So National Cyber Director, Senate confirmed, was our big thing. And with the chamber support and a lot of other, and not people who get along every day, groups coming together to say we have to have strategic leadership at the White House. If anything, COVID kind of convinced people that these non-strategic national security emergencies really need pre-planning, relationship building, and effective initial incident response at the White House. Three things that were missing, last February, that we would like to have for a cyber event and still don't have. So moving on, we got a lot done. I think we really focused on reforming the government and trying to build public-private collaboration. The first thing we want to do is go back and get some of the things we missed in in the 2021 Act on that. One of them, cyber state of distress. And I'm still trying to figure out how I lost it, but we had a bill, an amendment in both the House and the Senate, didn't get in. But this is the idea that early in a casualty, kind of like when FEMA can see a hurricane's coming, the hurricane hunters out there say one's coming or a tornado's coming, and they can start to activate the National Guard ahead of time. When CISA starts to feel like there's a lot going on, I'm getting a lot of incidents, that they could then have a path to bring over in the proper titles, the Department of Defense assets to help prepare for a cybersecurity incident, or get funding, to use private sector. Sometimes the private sector has the best response entities ahead of time, much like FEMA does. They use their authorities to both exercise other government agencies, but also the private sector to get them ready. Kind of bring things together to kind of get at a problem before it becomes a state of emergency. So that cyber state of distress, we think, is a big one. We failed in the Assistant Secretary of State for cybersecurity and emergency technology, but we're really close, really close. You can taste that. Maybe the title will change a little bit. Go back to what it says in the 2019 Cyber Diplomacy Act. But I think we'll be able to get the four corners on the Hill, plus the executive branch. And then there's a whole bunch of cyber ecosystem ones. These are the ones about a Bureau of Cyber Statistics, a national certification and labeling authority, akin to Underwriters Laboratory for cybersecurity issues. National lab centers that are concentrating on specific cybersecurity efforts, increasing the funding and the designation of maybe 2, 3, 4 of those to look at ICS control systems, some open software, things like that. We got we wanted to have a government strategy on how to use DMARC, foundational internet protocols on both DMARC and on DNS. We got the DMARC, but not the DNS. We want to go back and get the other half, things like that. That's about building an ecosystem for everybody that's better. And then finally, the joint collaborative environment, the information sharing environment. We did get in the part about get NKIC healthier. You mentioned NKIC, and I got to be honest with you, Dan, NKIC is it's a tough one to get your hands around. It is waxed and waned. I think it's in a downstroke right now. It's not where it needs to be as an information sharing thing. And I just hope that the US CERT and ICS CERT that were the backbone underneath it, still have the kind of like gold standard as it comes back up again. But, we call it the ICC, really because CISA didn't want us to call it the NKIC, which is unfortunate. I mean, I think they're losing some branding here, but I don't care. Call it whatever you want. You want an effective government organization that is the lead sled dog among government organizations for sharing information. And then also in there, we want to find out, how do you do something that was ordered in 2008 and still hasn't been done, which is the 8 or 9 classified cybersecurity centers in the intelligence community and other agencies that are supposed to be looking at the adversary. How can they exchange information seamlessly, not by email, but by speed of light transmission? And right now it's by email, and that's unacceptable, especially when you're in a crisis or a casualty like we're in right now. You need to have that. So fixing that and then running over it is, what's the kind of data lake? That's a tough term, but what's the kind of data, the device for bringing in the data from within the .gov, which still isn't done, and between the .gov and the private sector, so that the professionals can look through it and understand these are the trends, these are the threats, these are the problems we have. So that's what we're looking at. But starting with those basic ones up front to the an aspirational kind of joint collaborative environment at the back end. it'll be a busy year. And if we got it passed, I would call it the second most comprehensive cybersecurity legislation that we've ever achieved. Because I just think this year's, with National Cyber Director and COAT, Continuity of Economy Planning, and a few other things in there, if done appropriately, can really be game changers for how our government's organized and works with the private sector to respond to major cybersecurity. It's cyber incidents that aren't espionage like this, but are destructive or debilitating, like could happen.
I want to let Kathleen and Maggie jump in with their thoughts about what should be on policymakers' minds heading into 2021, and any reactions to those recommendations from the Commission.
Yeah, I mean, so our top ask, and I'm sure this is not going to be a shock to folks, has always been a dedicated grant fund from the federal government for state and local cybersecurity. States, they administer a lot of federal programs, and at this juncture, there's just too many demands on state budgets. Coronavirus is stretching everything thin. So it's incredibly difficult to take a look at some of the existing grant programs and leverage it. There really needs to be that individualized focus and attention on it. So, I mean, that's our top thing for policymakers. But there's just so much to respond to in what Mark said. Obviously, we're of the opinion that the Stafford Act sets too high a threshold. So, we're pleased to see the call of distress. And then, Dan, I don't know if you still wanted to talk about the supply chain, but that's something that we've been talking about a lot at the state level, just because we have seen those coordinated attacks in Texas and Louisiana where the threat vector was a managed service provider. So, that's been something we've been talking about for a while at the state level. We are, of course, states are the laboratories of democracy. So we have been seeing some kind of thought there around, if you are an MSP who is hired to protect the government and especially at the local level, there's some bills to consider. Should you have to register with the state? At the state level, a majority of states at this point do have laws that are minimum security standards. And of course, the term is reasonableness, which the lawyers love. So what exactly does that mean? We haven't seen enough enforcement to know yet. And then, Matthew, I don't know if you want to come on this too, but there's a schema in Ohio that's getting a lot of attention right now to create a safe harbor. So if companies can demonstrate that they've met a recognized national cybersecurity framework, something such as NIST or CIS Top 20, that would create an affirmative defense for liability. And could that be enough of a carrot to really get people to improve their cybersecurity?
I'm glad you threw that out there, Maggie. First, let me say that we were, I think, pretty bullish on a bill that Congressman Langevin and others had put together, HR 8048, that would provide some funding to states to help them do cyber better. I think with ransomware attacks kind of now maybe being eclipsed, at least in people's attention, by SolarWinds, they're not going away. And I think to the extent that local or state governments or small and mid-sized businesses in everybody's states feel that pinch, I think that's not good. But either way, funding for states and local governments to do cyber better, ultimately with the private sector, I think is a good thing. Yes, SB 220, I think as it's known in Ohio, is a good model in the sense that from a negotiation standpoint, I think what we like about it is there's a program, there's a little bit of a regulation to it. Companies get to choose from a number of programs that are already in existence, so there's nothing new per se, and then there's some level of protection. Indiana's kind of toying with something that's similar. I've got thoughts on that, but on balance, big picture, I think it's trying to achieve that ultimate goal. Kathleen, I don't know if you've got thoughts on that, but
yeah, I think that having something that affords liability protection is essential, and particularly as we see state laws, state data privacy laws, expanding the ability of consumers to sue. And I think that there needs to be some way that businesses can have some clarity about exactly what's expected of them to avoid litigation, and B, some incentive or some reward for taking the steps, for devoting the resources, expending the funds to make their system safer, and yet they're still potentially facing liability. So I think that that's important. Dan, with respect to other things, one thing that always concerned me about having an overall coordinator within the White House was what that does to congressional oversight. And I think that it's important to have somebody who's accountable, and somebody who's accountable to Congress and ultimately to the American people for the actions that they're taking. And I think that for too long, for 10 years plus, there has not been accountability within the government. There has not been somebody who's really taken responsibility for the government's inaction or poor action in some instances. So I think that needs to be a central component.
On that point, my mind turns to what we've learned about the recent attacks. And many of us, I worked at HISGAC, and back when we were reauthorizing FISMA, and then in 2015, there was aspects of the 2015 law that addressed some parts of updating FISMA and the Einstein program. And at the time, everybody knew that it was in the room that the Einstein program wasn't doing what it needed to do. And that law in 2015, we didn't authorize it in 2014. In 2015, that required DHS to come back and look at it and update it within a few years. The latest I saw that they were planning to phase in new provisions, which may have stopped what we know about the current breach in 2022. And some of this raises questions about the capability, not just of answering Congress through oversight, but the capabilities of the agencies that we've vested most of the responsibility. I don't know if you have any reaction.
And the capability of Congress to understand what needs to be done. I think that that's also a core issue. I mean, I know when cybersecurity first started coming up with in earnest on the Hill, we were explaining basic concepts to members. And so there just is a lack of knowledge. And Mark, Matt, you may have had similar experiences.
I think Mark will probably say that a number of members are well educated, certainly those on the commission. Once you go beyond there, it's probably a little bit of humility to say that absent staff, I think a lot of members, frankly, some folks in the business community too, of course, are going to struggle with some of these things. And I think maybe we make it too complicated. I think there's going to definitely be some cyber issues here in play, as everybody knows here. What explains things from a cyber standpoint? I think a foreign policy standpoint, we don't really play as much in that space, but I think these are ultimately going to need to be kind of part of a bigger package. Business risk management questions, right? How did this all happen? One thing I'd love to see that kind of dovetails with CISA 2015 is, my personal views. I'd love to be able to kind of create a safe room where all parties, government and private sector, could enter. And unless somebody's doing something grossly negligent, something just way out of bounds. Nothing bad happens, no regulatory actions, no liability protections, but no liability, there would be liability, let's say safeguards, but people would be able to speak absolutely honestly, quickly kind of get to the nut of what's transpired and quickly develop remedies. I think too often, as we've already started to see, too many discussions about, hey, who did what in the private sector or government wrong. I think we want to get to red teaming, I think, is its best understood. I think we got to learn from some of these things. I'm not sure we're learning from these things. At least I'm not convinced that we are. I think there are shortcomings all the way around, but I don't know if we're really learning where I could go, here's where we've learned, and we're going to do better next time. I don't think we've gotten there yet. That's just my personal view.
So I'll jump in on a couple issues. One, I think Kathleen will be happy. The way this bill is written, it's a Senate confirmed job, so they're going to have to, the national coordinator have to come up. And ironically, most of us that worked in the NSC over the years, kind of you have a natural reaction to that. But the people who are actual national coordinators, we interviewed all of them. A majority, not all, but a majority wanted the Senate confirmed. They just realized from their own personal experience that to some degree, they could not provide that fulsome thing. And look, Congress, one of two things would have to happen for Congress to get the straight skinny, in one sitting. One is either the executive branch had a national leader, a national cyber director, who was Senate confirmed, or we reorganized the Congress into one cyber committee. We had a cyber committee like the Intelligence Committee or the Homeland Security. And I think it's in 67 committees right now. It could definitely be in less. It's not going to get to one or two. And Armed Services and CISA will be the two, and they're in HPSI and HASC will be the four committees first in line to stop that from happening, but they'll do it. So I do like that idea. And I also want to say Maggie was spot on the IT security funding for state and local. If you think about, I can guarantee, I'm proud that my state and county balance their budget, and I'm proud that they keep my taxes low. Therefore, I'm not going to be proud about their cybersecurity investment, because if you balance your budget and you keep your taxes low, cybersecurity being where it plays as a priority in municipalities' budgets is not going to be sufficient. It's not going to be the 8 or 10 cents of every IT dollar. So I think one of the things the federal government can do is say, if we're giving you money for IT, especially say after COVID, to fix systems that were found to not be IT up to par, for distributing federal funds, then you must spend the relevant amount on IT security. The important amount. So we're going to work. I know Representative Langevin's already tried it once. We'll try it again to kind of make that happen. But I think IT security in our municipalities, and if you think about things our municipalities run, like our water supply, one of the most vulnerable systems, I think, and very hard to protect. And it really needs more investment, and it may require the federal government at some point.
Mark, that quick point on the DoD CMMC, the maturity models, I think we may have an opportunity to see, and I know you've rung this bell, I think rightly so, meaning all DoD contractors will have to meet some level of certification, a maturity level. It's going to be interesting to see what those costs really are. And if we're able to biopsy, as I like to think of it, some of that data to figure out whether or not that CMMC program works, right, for business and government. TBD, but I think that's something, again, we don't really have good data to know, but point well taken.
We're about out of time. I wanted to give each of our panelists a time to make a few closing remarks. I'll start with you, Kathleen, here.
I applaud what the commission's done. I hope there's some success there. Mark, I love your optimism about congressional oversight and a Senate confirmed position. I think having a Senate confirmed position in the White House is still going to be an issue. But I do love your optimism. And I agree that SASC and HASC and SSCI and HPSI are going to have to continue to lead in these areas, but I think that other committees, Dan, you spent a lot of time on his GAC and did wonderful work there. I think that there just is going to have to be a greater effort within Congress to try to look at these issues moving forward. And I think that CISA needs a lot of improvement. I was not happy with a lot of the compromises, but again, that's the nature of the beast.
Maggie?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for this. Information sharing, no question, from our folks' perspective has improved, but challenges remain. And I love what this panel said about just using that as an opportunity for additional collaboration. So please consider the states in all of your plans to further operational collaboration and enhancing cybersecurity.
Matt?
Yeah, Dan, thanks. And everybody, great to see you all. It was a lot of hard work to get CISA done 5 years ago plus, and everybody here made a contribution, or at least many of you did. And we'll be at it again with reauthorization in 5 quick years. I would like to think that maybe one of our strengths is, as we see here, is debating these kinds of issues, our pluses and minuses, openly, unlike maybe some of our adversaries, China, Russia. Iran, North Korea. Those are our adversaries don't do these kinds of things. And I think hopefully, even though we've got flaws, we point them out and we debate them openly. Hopefully we're better for it. I'd like to think we are. Anyway, thanks for having me.
Thanks. Mark?
I'll just go quickly and say I think that the CISA 2015 was useful. It got information sharing moving. I just think it's one of these things that we have to update all of our national security legislation as frequently as you update the armed services and the Department of Defense's legislation. So, I mean, the goal here then is to attack and re-attack every year because the adversary moves the goalposts every year. And I just think cyber is one of those domains that's going to require it. But thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you for that. And thanks to each of you for sharing your part of your afternoon with us, and to our guests. We're thrilled to have you, and hope you all have a nice holiday. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
See you all. Bye-bye.